Let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Nandan. I write software for a company called Arista Networks. You can check us out at arista.com. We make switches and stuff. I tend to spend a lot more time on Twitter than I should, and you can ping me there. The next slide, please. So the key focus of today's talk is really about writing beautiful software, right? I'm going to try to give you a few steps to going about how to do that. And the quote that was there in the previous slide was from John Keats. And the thing is, we often think of beauty as being subjective, to a certain extent that is, but there are objective criteria as well to evaluate something that we treat as engineering, right, which is code. And we look at some of these things over the course of the next hour. So this is pretty much what I had in mind of going over. Simplicity, readability, efficiency, testing, usability, continuous learning. There's no gymming or any fad diets in that, but that's pretty much on what we have in the post-lunch menu. Next slide, please. Okay. So Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was a French philosopher in the early part of the 20th century, and he said something like, perfection in design is achieved when there's simplicity, right? How do you make something which is functional yet at a bare minimum? The next slide, please. So this is a comic from one of my favorite strips. What do you see when you look at this, right? What stands out for you guys when you see this, right? You'll see, to me at least, what stood out was milk, crackers, tissues, peanut, potato chips, bread. So the point this slide is trying to make is, if you keep it simple, that's when you get noticed, right? If you go to a grocery store and you will not buy the things with all these colorful covers because you don't know what is there. It just takes away from the essence of it, which is essentially some food in a piece of packaging, right? And this also brings me to another thing. When you think about comics, which is another thing that I like a lot, you will notice that most comics are drawn with just a few lines, right? There's a circle and there are 2 lines, and that contains all the expressive power of a human face if you were to, even without having to replicate all of the features, right? That is simplicity. It's about keeping what is essential and then getting rid of what is not. Next slide, please. So this is a little more technical definition of it. So the word origin of simplicity apparently comes from a single fold, which means in a rope, right? If you have all of these, they're interweaved, right? That's how you make a rope, right? Interweaving the strings. And simplicity, basically simple means one fold. So the idea is that you do only one thing in a module or in a unit of work. So that could be anything from a function to a class. So if you even think about, let's say, human evolution, or even humans or even the universe, right? We start out with atoms. They're essentially very simple, right? And then you can combine them into something, into molecules, and then you combine them, and then you get cells, and then you combine the cells, you get a human being. So something as complicated as a human being starts essentially at a cell, right? And so all of that comes from the atom. So the point is, when you are trying to do or trying to break up your code, structure it such that each entity is doing only one thing, and then make that entity interact with the other entities in your system. What is simplicity not? We'll just look at, so some people confuse simplicity with ease. So if something is simple, it doesn't necessarily mean it is easy to either understand or build, right? An atom isn't easy to understand. It took us years to figure that out, right? But it's also not to be confused with the count, right? So if you have one function which does one thing, it's not about, simplicity doesn't mean you can't call that 10 times or 15 times, right? what it means is that one function or that one class or that one module needs to do only one thing, and that is to keep the screen alive. So, I mean, look at the screensaver, right? That's the only thing it does, but it does it well, except that it shouldn't be on screen right now. Interesting story is, okay, I'll come to that story after this. Now that looks like they wanted the story of the screensaver. Interestingly, screensavers were apparently invented because back in the day, monitors would literally burn if you put the same image on them for a very long time. We don't really need them, but we still hang on to them. There's a very nice talk about simplicity itself by Rich Hickey, who's the creator of the Clojure language. And I did take some of the ideas about simplicity from that talk, and I would encourage you guys to, if you're interested, to talk more about it, to go and listen to it. The next slide, please. Okay, let's hope. So I was talking about Unix, and Unix is one of my favorite things. And I'm not going to show you any code, but I'll just give you this one example of a Unix command, right? When people talk about simplicity, Unix is what comes to mind. Unix is like powering pretty much every device, mobile device here, right? You're either running Linux or iOS. I hope none of you has a Windows, machine. But the thing is, if you look at Unix and the user space, it is composed of hundreds of commands, and each of them does only one thing. So if you take this command, for instance, you have SSH, which SSHs to a particular machine, and then you run this command, which is cat, and you're printing that, and then what you're doing is you're diffing it with a file on your machine, and then you're going to just basically the output of the first command will come to your standard input, and then you will diff it with local file. So the thing is, you can build up very complex things and complicated things which look completely indecipherable at the start, right, by using a lot of very simple things. So when you think about your code, it's very essential that you break it down into modules that are small and do only one thing and do it really well. So the second thing that I want to talk about is readability of code. We always want to be writing code, but it's really important to focus on readability of code. This quote is actually one of my favorite ones. Programs should be written for people to read and only incidentally for machines to execute. It's absolutely fascinating because we think of, when you're studying, you're told that programs are what computers execute and code is what computers understand. The point is, code is a way for humans to interact with each other more than it is for them, for us to interact with machines, because computers only understand ones and zeros, right? Programming languages were created so that it's easier for humans to write more complicated things. And when you write code, it absolutely, readability has to be your #1 priority. We'll come to our performance and all of that, but you have to ensure that it's readable. Why is that, right? Just think about a regular work day that you have at work when you're reading code. You're spending a lot of time reading code and cursing the guy who wrote it, right? And often you discover when you go through the change history in your source control management, you'll find that that person was you, right? So the point is, coding is never done by one person. There are always two people in a team. One is you and the other one is you 6 months later. So you must ensure that you are able to read your own code, and we'll see some ways of doing that. These are some fairly, I would say, obvious things, but if you've gone into any large code base, you will find all instances of these things. Single letter names to your identifiers and enormous long functions that are composed of thousands of lines, which if you start scrolling, you're like, you don't even know where you're at, right? Inconsistent formatting, this is absolutely annoying because especially like if you're using a language like Python, for instance, right? I love Python, but one of the things that absolutely annoys me about Python is that it treats indentation as part of the syntax. So if you want to take a block of code out and move it, you often end up having one if you don't have your indentation set up correctly, you'll end up having some code that is not meant to execute inside a for loop that's doing it. And then you find your code running 500 times slower than it should, right? Because it's doing one function 500 times, it should be doing it only once. So it's absolutely important to make sure that your formatting is consistent. The idea here is that it doesn't matter what it is, right? It doesn't matter if you choose to use four spaces to a tab, or to use no tabs and only spaces. As long as everybody on the team agrees to something, that's all that matters. And you just have to be consistent. Unnecessary one-liner. Some people try to show off how smart they are with their code. It's not a good idea. I have a better quote on that why. And this is the reason you shouldn't try to be too clever, right? Because debugging your code is infinitely harder than writing it in the first place. Because not only has a lot of time gone by since you wrote it, it's running with a bunch of inputs that you probably have never seen. It's running at a site, maybe it's running at a customer site, you don't know what inputs and what they're running it against. So debugging is incredibly much harder than actually writing code, and therefore you should not be as clever as you possibly can be, because you are only this clever. So unless you can become twice as smart in 6 months, every 6 months, just don't try to show off while writing the code. It's just a bad idea, because it'll come back to bite you only. And there's another quote which says that write code as if the guy who's going to maintain it knows where you live and is a violent psychopath. So just keep that in mind. We have a board of that somewhere in our office. So I just had a few comments on comments. So when you look at code, right, there are three things to it. There is the what, there is the how, and there is the why. What that code is doing and how it's doing is the code itself, right? So if you have 5 lines of code that's opening a file, reading something, storing it into a variable, and then sorting it, you can make that out. But why is that doing it? Why is it trying to chunk it in 100 lines at a time? Why is not reading the whole file in one shot? Why do I have a +1 in my index? That sort of thing. Why? So when anybody is trying to understand old code, the thing that helps most is, why is the code the way it is? Sometimes it's as simple as, oh, I don't know, I just chose 5 because it seemed like a nice number, right? But people need to know, because when you're trying to change code, you need to understand what the other person was thinking when he wrote that code. Sometimes he wasn't, but the point is, if you don't, and that only comes from a good comment in the code. And yeah, I mean, sometimes I have seen files where it's hard to find the code in the file because there's a whole bunch of comments. So it's a tough ask, but just keep in mind that you always try to say why the code is the way it is, because that's what's going to help you or anybody else who's going to look at it later. So we're going to look at efficiency for a bit now that we've talked about things that are more important, but then eventually you come to a point where your code is got to scale, and then, well, how do you do it? This is a very interesting quote. More computing sins are committed in the name of efficiency, including blind stupidity. Donald Knuth said that premature optimization is the root of all evil. This is pretty much saying the same thing. So don't, we'll see. Now, some people I know tend to write code as if they're running on some computer with infinite cores or whatever. And why bother, right? We have Moore's law. Computers are just going to keep getting faster. Our phones today have more CPU and RAM than the fastest computers did a few years ago. So why bother? But the point is, those phones are also trying to do more work than what those computers did 20 or 30 years ago. So you're back to the same problem of, how do I get a phone that doesn't stop responding when I try to make a call? So it's the same thing. And there are a lot of applications where even if you have a lot of hardware, you are going to suffer from performance problems if you're not thinking about deploying your software at scale. It's very easy to build something overnight that works and is demoable, but there's a complete difference between something that has to stay up every day and deal with millions and billions of users, right? So So efficiency does matter, but it's not something you should do right away. You've got to get your code out of the door, and it's got to work, and then you focus on efficiency. So I picked a couple of, about 4 principles here from John Bentley, and the first one is, again, going back to code simplification, right? Most fast programs are simple, right? If I like to tell people that every line of code is a potential bug. The same way, every line of code not written is work not done, right? If the computer has to execute less code, then that code is going to be faster. There is no other way. I mean, if you can not do some work and tell the computer not to do it, that is easily the fastest way to improve your code, right? And so keep things simple, because they're going to get easier to understand, easier to debug, easier to optimize. Problem simplification. So what does this mean? You can start writing, oh, I'm going to write a brand new web server. It's going to be the hottest thing ever. But you've got to figure out how many users do you want it to support. You got to decide that in advance and then build for that. If you are running an application that you expect only 10 people to use twice a day, you can get away with linked lists or whatever data structure. But if it's going to be something that is going to be used by millions of people hundreds of times a day, then you have to think through and use different data structures, different ways of solving the same problem. So you have to figure out what the problem is, and then not do the parts of the problem that are not necessary. If you're building a system that only needs to support 1,000 users, don't try to write something using the latest and greatest data structure or algorithm, because it's only going to create bugs. It's somewhat similar. Always question the necessity of each instruction. It says instruction was written in 1982, these things, but the idea is this piece of code really needed? Do I need to do this? I remember an issue that we had a few years ago where somebody found that we were copying all the data required to trace, even if tracing was disabled. And then the guy moved that code to inside the if tracing enabled, and the code was now running 10% faster. So you always will find these hidden away bugs in your code and hidden away things. Question everything, which is why, again, coming back to the whole thing about why is the code doing what it does, right? If somebody is trying to get rid of some code, he will know whether, why it's needed, what it's doing. And this early binding thing is not always possible, but this is similar to, like, say, caching. If you know that when a user is going to come in, he's going to want his photograph or his name, you may want to move. This is essentially locality of reference, right? Try to do things ahead of time, pre-compute some results if you can. A classic example is like when you compute checksums, right? One way is you iterate over all the bytes and then you compute it, but another way of doing checksums is using table lookup. So for every byte that you will get, you will know what its checksum value is. You don't have to apply the entire formula on it. So you just do a lookup. So it's a space-time trade-off, but it works. Okay. Now that we have code that's simple, readable, hopefully performing to the specs, we have to debug them. And Alan Perlis has a whole number of really, really funny quotes. I would encourage you later to just Google Alan Perlis's quotes. There are 2 ways to write error-free programs, and the only one that works is the third one, right? So we are all human, and that's why we have computers, right? We are all going to make mistakes, right? So the solution to the problem isn't to avoid mistakes. The solution to the problem is to find them and fix them before your user sees them. And there's really only one way to do it, which is testing. And you really, 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 really need to automate. The reason for that is it's very simple. People build a bridge. It stays on for 100 years or whatever, depending on how well it was built, or as in the case of bridge over River Kwai, it gets destroyed very soon. But the point is, software isn't like that. Software is continually changing. You are always going to find something to change in that software. and then how do you know that after making that change, the code is still doing what it is supposed to do, right? And the only way you can do that is if you have tests you can trust. Your code is only as good as the tests you have. Your ability to refactor code, your ability to change your code is only as good as your tests. If you have absolutely no confidence in your tests, you will hesitate every time somebody asks you to make a change. And this is very true. At my last job, we used to have manual testers, and if we didn't find them, we couldn't essentially make a change because we didn't have anybody to test it. In my current job, what we do is we always have tests running, so I can go in after this conference, go make some change, run my tests, knowing that whatever I changed is still good. And this also allows you to get into code you're not familiar with. Often you find teams working in silos, right? They only work on the area of code they're familiar with. They're not willing to look at the system as a whole, look at wider areas across their code. And the reason for that is they're not familiar with the code. And if they want to change something, they don't know what they're going to be breaking. But if it's a package or a module that's well tested and has a lot of tests, somebody from the outside will just come in, make some changes, and then he'll know that, okay, this is going to work. Couple of things here is that you have to figure out the dependency between the code and the test. Some people do it at a wider granularity, like if any line of code changes in a module, I rerun all the modules. Some people have figured out how to map that dependency much better so that, like, okay, if this piece of code is touched, I need to run these tests. The others are not impacted. So that affects your overall productivity, but it's something you should keep in mind. And you have to have some amount of testing and treat it as part of a build or some basic sanity, right? And you have to beat up people in your team to go and do this because otherwise people will just check in whatever they want and it's going to break, and then you have hundreds of people who are just, drinking coffee and not doing anything. And their excuse isn't that my code is compiling, it's like, oh, I can't even build the code, right? Manual testing is something that I'm not particularly a fan of, but we've realized, all of us have realized the hard way that there's only so much you can automate, and you always need some amount of oversight. There's something that a person who is not familiar with your code, who's being told there's a black box, beat the crap out of it, he's going to do something to it that you wouldn't have thought of, right? And that way, that's a kind of need. And in some cases, it's not actually possible. For instance, user interfaces tend to be in that category where it's kind of hard to automate the tests. And before you think testing is the solution to all your problems, this is an absolutely fabulous code because testing can only show you and shake out the bugs that you have, but it cannot guarantee that there are no more bugs left in your code, right? I hope that makes sense, right? Because you cannot ever say with any degree of certainty, unless you have covered all the code paths and all possible ways to traverse those code paths, to say that my code is completely bug-free, and that is virtually impossible on any code of any practical size, right? Unless it's like 2 lines of code, it's virtually impossible. And if you think that even small programs, you can do it, I think there was a case recently of a binary sort, I think a binary search program that was present in a popular book, which they found a bug in after like 20 years or something. So even with small pieces of code, you can never be certain that there are no bugs. But the point is, once you've tested, you can say with a degree of certainty, okay, this is going to work, it's not going to crash on your head, and that sort of thing. The sky is not going to fall on your head. One thing that we look at is user interfaces. When I say user interface, I don't necessarily mean just a graphical user interface that we are familiar with on a computer or on your phones and stuff. Even command line interfaces, or even for that matter APIs, or APIs that you export from one module to another, they all count as interfaces, right? And Jeff Raskin, who's an ex-Apple guy, has this quote that an interface is humane if it's responsive to the needs and considerate to the frailties. What this means is you make the user interface respond in a manner that, and you don't punish him for a misstep. Like if I press this clicker twice, it's actually going to go to slides, which is fine, but if I drop it, it probably shouldn't do anything. Or if I press a button that is not at all related to the slide, it shouldn't, right? Or if you have an API that is, you're calling it with some bad data, it shouldn't go and crash. It can probably return an error, and then you have to check for it, right? So you have to be able to accommodate human frailties. I have a bunch of principles. Some of them, I guess, are fairly obvious, but the point is, it's the obvious things that we miss, right? User interface has to be clear, right? Like, I couldn't figure out which button to press to move the slides forward, so that's clearly failed that. It has to be concise, which essentially means it's got to be small. Now, if you think about command line interfaces or the Unix CLI, right, most of the commands are 3 or 4 letters or 5 letters at the most, because it's a pain to type out something longer, right? And if it's concise, then it's easier to use. Consistent. Well, again, take the Unix CLI. You can pretty much say if you give -h to any command on a Unix box of any kind, you're going to get the help, right? So consistency is really important. If you look at a lot of, I mean, Apple does this really well. Most of their apps look absolutely identical in where they place the buttons, the menus, irrespective of whether it's running on the laptop or the tablet or the phone. It's extremely hard to get because the thing is you have to get a lot of people involved to make it consistent. Everybody who's building an user interface needs to say, okay, I'm going to do it in a particular way. And often what happens in big companies is people, everybody sort of trips over each other and tries to control their own dominion. So it's very hard to get that coordination, which is why a consistent user interface is typically something you find either in places with good dictators, as Steve Jobs was, or in places in early stage startups where there's only one guy doing the UI, right? It's kind of hard otherwise, because I mean, we can't get 10 people to follow the traffic rules, so that's really hard problem. It's got to be familiar. Like it's very funny nowadays to save a file, it's still a floppy disk icon, right? I mean, you take a 14-year-old kid and you show him a floppy drive, he'll think, oh, you got the you've taken the icon and 3D printed it. And this sort of joke is very common these days, right? It's absolutely incomprehensible to someone why the icon for save needs to look like that, unless you have the history. For the same reason, you know, when you use a keyboard, the keys are mixed up. I mean, you get used to that, but the only reason the keys are lined up like that is old typewriters used to jam if people typed too fast, and they actually literally had to slow people down, which is why they jumbled, but we still have it, right? So it has to be familiar, so then person knows what they're doing. That, I mean, if you put a red button and that turns on something, that's probably not a good idea, right? Because people expect red to stop something. It has to be responsive. You don't want somebody to press a button and then something responds after like a week. I mean, exaggerating, but like after a few minutes, because you're going to keep pressing the button and you're going to, and it has to be forgiving. Like I said, you don't want to punch a guy in the face if he presses the wrong button, unless it's some weird device. So I'm coming to pretty much the last part of the talk. If you think about it, the 4 things we talked about were about code and things we can do to improve that. User interfaces is about the user. And the final thing that we're going to talk about is about the people writing this code, which is pretty much everyone in this room. So the point is, the thing here is you have to always be willing to learn. I mean, if you're in this room, you pretty much have that mindset because you're taking the effort to show up at a conference post lunch, and most of you are still awake, so thank you. The thing is, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. The thing is, we live in a world where things keep changing. What somebody accepted a few years ago as the gold standard is no longer true. scientists for a long time had believed that it's fats that make you fats. The current theory is carbs make you fat and not fats. So, you keep learning that, and if you're not willing to take in that new information that keeps coming out and adjust and put yourself out there, you're just going to stagnate. I don't know how many of you remember these books that were there a few years ago. They were very popular in the late 90s, early 2000s. They essentially had a headline called Teach Yourself and then some programming language or some technology buzzword in 21 days or 21 hours. I think it started as 21 days, and then they came up with editions that were 21 hours. And they had one chapter each with you do in 1 hour and you teach yourself programming. This is taken from a really nice webcomic called Abstruse Goose. And he essentially tells you that the only way to teach yourself programming in 21 days is to build a time machine. Because you cannot teach yourself programming in any number of days. It's something that you keep doing, right? You keep learning. And if you think that, of course, you can reach some level of proficiency in 21 days or 21 months, but you're constantly learning. And it's absolutely foolish to think that you can teach yourself anything in 21 days or 21 hours or 21 minutes. There's a very nice analogy that some people like to make about the brain being like software, and the fact that essentially you can patch your brain with fixes or upgrades. Every time you learn a new skill, it's essentially you are updating the software in your brain. And every time you figure out how to do something correctly after repeatedly having failed at it, you're essentially fixing a long-standing bug, right? So, so you have to treat your brain like software. And once you treat your brain like software, you're going to end up making better software, which is really the point of this talk. Reading about learning, this is kind of a meta statement. You have to also know how to learn. It's not just about keeping on learning new technologies, because your mind is only going to be able to absorb so much. So you have to think in terms of higher abstractions. I have an example that's pretty much the only code I'm showing in this talk, but the thing is, you can learn at a certain pace. It's very hard to absorb more than that amount, a certain amount of information, no matter how smart you are. So the only way you're going to get better is to think about new ways of learning, new ways of studying, or finding out some productivity hacks, all those things, because otherwise you're just going to be spending more and more time trying to learn, and we don't want that either. Get out of your comfort zone, which could be anything, right? Like teach yourself a new programming language, or get into, you could even do this in your day job, right? Get into some code that you haven't seen before. It's a module that you're not familiar with. The guy sitting next to you fixes bugs in it, takes some bug out, or he writes code in that. So you just go and get into that, because I think one of the biggest things with trying to learn something is just our fear that we will not be able to learn it, or we're not good enough to learn it. It's something all of us struggle with, and even, needless to say, I do too. So you really have to keep pushing out. So this is an example I took from the Haskell website. Haskell is this strictly typed functional programming language. This, of course, is a C++ implementation of Quicksort, right? If you see, it's taken me 2 columns in the slide to fit this in. I'll show you the Haskell equivalent, which is 5 lines of code. It looks strange, but it is not. What it says is Quicksort takes a list and returns a list. Quicksorting an empty list is an empty list, fairly obvious. Quicksorting a list of elements, which from x to x's, is essentially a recursive definition of quicksorting all the elements that are less than x and quicksorting all the elements which are more than x. So how do you define what is less than x? Well, less is you filter all the elements that are less than x, and whatever is greater is the rest. So when I first saw it, I was always skeptical about functional programming. A lot of people in academia have been pushing it, because a lot of people believe we've reached the stage where imperative programming languages like C or C++ or Java, where you spell out every single step of how to do a particular operation, is essentially responsible for causing a lot of problems, because it's very hard for people to keep so much information in their head and get it right. So you work on a higher level of abstraction, which is almost like writing a mathematical formula, and everything is a function, and you do that, let the compiler, let the computer do the hard work, the heavy lifting of figuring out how it needs to be put into something that the computer understands. You write code in a manner that you understand. This is, I mean, it's essentially taking that whole concept of not writing in ones and zeros and then moving up to assembly, then moving up to a higher level language. But I mean, functional languages have been around from the 50s since Lisp, but they're seeing a real comeback. The most famous example, I guess, would be WhatsApp with Erlang, right? It really is a great example of choosing the right programming language for the problem they had. Erlang was designed for extreme parallelism, so, and that's what WhatsApp used, and which is why companies with 5 people are able to run websites with billions of users, right? It's not that they're super smart or anything. They're using the right tools, they're using the right abstractions, and they've, well, there's a certain amount of luck, but they've made some good design decisions along the way. So you always have to be willing to think about new ways of doing things, and you know, I think that's all I had. So I'll open up for questions. Okay, looks like everybody slept through it.
Hey, I had a question.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
There's a lady at the back.
You have the mic.
Also mean minimalism?
Yes, it
One and the
is.
same thing?
Well, yes, that's one aspect of it, yes. I mean,
Yes,
it's just two different words, yeah.
Because I read the quote that says you achieve simplicity when there's nothing else to remove.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is minimalism. It's just that I guess I chose to call it simplicity. But one aspect is that taking away what is unnecessary. The other aspect is having self-contained units of work that do only one thing. So it's coming from both those aspects. So at one side, you take away stuff. So let's say you have a piece of code, you have a function, right? You take away whatever, you figure out, okay, this function is supposed to do this. And then let's say you have some code, then you say, okay, what is in this that is not necessary to do that? And then you remove it. And what you're left with is that one function which does only one thing. So it kind of comes from both things, but yeah, it is minimalism in some sense, yes.
Hi, I have a question.
It's on.
Hi, the question is like when in companies, when we come across big sets of codes for some big application or some platform or anything, we come across many new technologies, be it in Java or any other language, new language we are picking up. So how do we ensure that like we are learning from that and we are on pace? As in, if I see some new technology, I might tend to start it from the scratch. But if I'm starting it from the scratch, I might not be having that much time to start it from the scratch and then come to that point wherein that is being used in that code like in such a wonderful way. So like how to ensure that in this time frame I am able to learn?
Yeah, so the question is essentially how do you learn something new without starting from scratch, because that takes too long. My answer to that would be to try to implement a small project, maybe over a weekend or something. Have a fixed goal in mind, saying that, okay, let's say your goal is to learn some aspect of Java, right? As an example, what you should try to do is write a minimal app which does a few things. Then along the way, what you will see is you will find yourself looking for the things you need to learn to do that. Rather than if you start from a Java for beginners thing with all the data types and all of that, because if you have some experience already, you know that. So what you're interested in is figuring out what is it that I need to know to do things on a day-to-day basis. And the only way you can do that is to actually work on a real project. So one idea is you can maybe figure out some small project which you can work on your own, maybe convert some piece of code you have in another language, especially if the language is something very different, then that's one strategy that works, because like the example I gave you, it's completely different. So even just taking an existing piece of code that you understand, converting it to something that is strange works. Another approach, it's a little harder because you end up with sort of the same chicken and egg problem, is to maybe look at some of the open source code, or maybe in your case, if you are familiar with, if you know somebody who knows that code, asking somebody those key things that they use or they keep in their mind, that will help you get, it's essentially an 80-20 principle is there, right, the Pareto principle. You have to figure out that 20% of work that will give you that 80% of benefit. So easiest way is to just do stuff. Even I found that if you open a book and you try reading it, you don't really retain it. So best way is to just try to do a small project. I think if you're trying to learn something, best way is to try to do a small project and just build something using it. That's probably the best way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That just do what they're supposed to do in the simplest and most intuitive way. But when you look at large systems, a lot of people today have been talking about problems of scale. And when there are millions and millions of users, it requires different kinds of thinking and different kinds of programming. Would you have certain examples of perhaps a few best practices that you would look at? I'm making an assumption here, the assumption being that writing small functional pieces, like for example, WhatsApp, I'm assuming, was one function that did one thing, and it's doing it really well. But the systems that support that kind of millions and millions of users using this piece of functionality need to be designed and coded very differently. So what, do you have any examples that you would cite as best practices?
I would say the single biggest thing to do is have very well-defined interfaces between these modules, right? I mean, see, the thing is when we think about the end system and what it is supposed to do, right? We tend to sort of build a lot of things continuously together in that, to get that functionality. So, I mean, the best way to go about it would be to split that up into different units and then figure out what is the smallest unit that you can treat as an individual entity and then get them to interact together. It's essentially about using composition better than trying to say inherit a bunch of things because, oh, I have this Blaze class which does something and then I want something to do a little more than this, I'll take another, and then you'll end up with a huge mess, right? So the way around it is you can take a new thing, you take an element of that, use it, and then build on top of that. So the idea with trying to build this simplicity model is to favor composition over inheritance, I would say. So that's pretty much, yeah, I mean. And the other thing is like when you talk about scaling, right? Right now I'm like at work, we're trying to get our code to scale, and it's very hard when you have, even from, the thing is you're always working with text, and what you're working with is pure code, right? And if you have like 10 functions that are 300 lines each, and I need to figure out where my bottleneck is, I have to first figure out the function, and then I have to figure out, oh, does it need to do all the 300 things it's doing? Can I get rid of it in some, then I'll have to split that. So you'll end up with, eventually with some modules that are going to do smaller things and then interact with each other. So, but I don't know if I answered your question, but that's how I look at it. Because at scale, if you have a monolithic system, it's even harder to debug because you have to start from top to bottom, right? I mean, you have to go through the whole thing. Whereas if you know the pieces, and even from a testability point of view, right? If you have something that's isolated, then you can test that, and you know. I mean, one of the things is people nowadays, a lot of people who say don't use global variables as much as possible. You avoid it, right? And a classic example of a bad piece of code which had a lot of global variables was this Toyota software with the braking defect, right? They did an analysis that had like 10,000 global variables in the control unit. So this sort of thing keeps happening, and that is again one of the things a lot of people about functional programming they talk about, because what they say is in purely functional programming, you have a function, it takes an input, gives an output, there is no global state. So no matter where you plug that function, it's always going to, given that input, give you that output. So it reduces your test scope and things like that. But that's an ideal world where it doesn't happen in reality. So we should try to get as close to that as possible. It just should be easy for you to like break things up and then focus on certain areas. That's, I don't know, long-minded.
A lot of times when we're writing code and we participate in competitions like ICPC and on CodeChef also there are questions. The code compiles and the answers right, test cases match, but a lot of times you get time limit exceeded. So can you suggest some ways to get rid of that? Improve the efficiency?
Okay, I have a couple of things to say on that. I'm not a huge fan of coding competitions personally because I think they get you to focus on different aspects of writing code, which isn't necessarily something you will, which isn't necessarily the thing that you would need the most at work. Because in a coding competition, you're thinking about how can I solve a problem very, very quickly. You're testing speed, but often solutions you come up with take time and you. But it's sort of an aside. To answer your question, it really is about understanding what bounds they have put on those problems, right? Usually it comes down to the amount of work your code is doing, which is essentially a function of the data structure or algorithm. But I mean, oftentimes it is the data structure that gives you the most bang for the buck. You may have written this example of putting things on a list versus a tree or list versus hash tables and things like that, right? It usually boils down to that. You're just using the wrong data structure most of the time. The other thing is if you understand the problem that well, it can come down to not doing a certain amount of work. You might be doing extra work, but I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer than that.
Hi. After various sessions that I've attended, so I plan to teach a bunch of kids, like high school kind of kids, some language because it sounded like a cool thing to do for the kids. So I was asking for a suggestion of which language would be nice for the kids to learn at this point so they can enjoy as well and it'll be good in the long run.
I think to learn, I guess nothing beats Python these days. I mean, still I would say it's Python for the simple reason that it's very easy to get started with. It does teach you a few things well in the sense that the fact that the indentation is part of the syntax can be frustrating, but it is something that encourages people to do things the right way. My only problem with choosing any high-level language as such is that often you have kids not understanding the computational model, like how does the computer work. What I found is, so say I work mostly in systems programming, right? I deal mostly in C, C++, and we write a lot of stuff in Python as well. But so my thinking is always that people who come from, it's easier to go from a background that that you grew up with on a language with manual memory management where it's very close to the underlying hardware on which it is running, and then grow to something that is on a higher level of abstraction like Python or any of the functional languages. So if you're willing to live with that, any high-level language like Python or Java or anything would be a good start because it will give them an opportunity to build something they can see and use. And so, I mean, sometimes at the end of the day, you want to see making progress, right? If you teach somebody C right away and it can take a while before they feel productive in such a language. So that's sort of where I'm at with this. There was a quote somebody had in an article where he said, writing C is like learning to drive a manual transmission car versus using a language, say Go or something, which has garbage collection is like driving an automatic. But if you want to get kids interested, then Python is what I think works.
So in answer to her question, right, I would also like,
yeah.
So in answer to a question, right, I would also like to add, there is a programming language you can start kids with, like Scratch or Alice programming language. In fact, there is a website called code.org.
Okay.
Okay, so people, if you want to help students out, you can always refer to it. In fact, ACM all over the globe, right? We have this second week of December where we have an hour of code, where we encourage people, professional people, to go over to schools and teach or introduce programming to kids for an hour. Okay, thanks.
If I just may add something, so so if you're trying to teach somebody programming, I think you should teach them like thinking in abstractions programming, which a good high-level language you would use. But I think you should also focus a little bit on how the computer actually works, because I mean, at end of the day, if you take it up as a profession or whatever, the hardest problems you're going to face are the ones at scale where you have to understand the underlying system, not just your own code. So just keep that in mind, but yeah, thanks. Hi.
Yeah, actually, there is always a confusion between code being simple and the flexibility, because we had a situation where the code program, wherever we were calling, was heavily overloaded. The function was overloaded because the other packages which call those functions have to be simple. Like however you call it should work. But actually, when it comes to debugging, it used to happen that we have to figure out what data types we are passing, and then the debugging was very problematic. Then I had an argument with actually my colleague whether the code is simple, or he said that it is more flexible, and it's more important that it's flexible. So,
well, you could argue it's a trade-off, but you have to define for who your target audience is for that simplicity, right? If you are a person writing a low-level library, you have to take the burden of the complexity and expose something very easy for the callers to use, right? And if the way you would have to go about designing the library would be to make it in such a way that you yourself don't shoot yourself in the foot when you are asked to give new features. But so when you talk about, no, but see, I mean, again, I would say we are, I think, confusing simplicity with ease of use. Simplicity is essentially about how many things that particular unit does and how coupled is it with the rest of the system, right? So in your case, the problem you are facing is that it's hard for you to write new code, not necessarily that the underlying libraries you're using were not simple. It's quite possible that the library was structured in a nice manner and that every API does only one thing. But when it's the interface that is then given to you is probably not easy to use. I mean, I don't know if that's really making sense, but we always tend to confuse simplicity with ease. Getting simplicity isn't easy. I mean, so it's not that if something is simple that it's easy. It's usually the opposite. So I don't know.
We are done with the song. Okay, that was a wonderful session. Thank you very much. I'd like to present a memento as a token of thanks. And as Nandan has mentioned, we have the Convene app. You can rate for the session on it, also give your comments on it. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.